Well, good morning. This will begin week 2 of the special ed assessment class. Um, I'm going to be sharing my desktop with some information as we move forward, and hopefully things are getting off to a good start for you. I noticed that people are responding in the discussion board to the week 1, and it certainly looks so far like we've got a number of people who have some considerable experience with assessment and report writing and so forth. This will all come in handy as we move forward. If I find that the vast majority of the class is set up that way, it may have some impact on how we approach some of the other activities. The one thing that I want to stress, though, is that you need to make sure that the case study is set up and ready to go. And there are several things that you need to do prior to getting rocking and rolling on that. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and then I'm going to go through various things with you. Okay, I'm actually going to go through quite an extensive piece with regard to evaluations and re-evaluations. I think you'll find that this will be pretty useful, and much of it might be something that's a review for you, and that's okay, because I think that it's not a bad idea for us to hear this repeatedly, because sometimes we take things for granted, and just getting new information can help us along at times. Another topic is data, continuing need transition. So in reevaluations, then we're looking at not necessarily certifying or making sure the kid meets criteria, but really just determining whether there's a continuing need for special ed services. Remember that whenever you do qualify a student for special education, there's 2 questions. The first question is, do they meet criteria? And the second question is, are they in need of special ed services? So both of those things are important. Okay. The next area we're going to talk about in a little bit is with regard to validity and testing. And as validity, as you know, is making sure that the testing is actually measuring what it is that you want it to measure. And then standardization and confidentiality of test materials and content. And finally, a section on native or English testing. And there's actually a document that I will show you later in the course materials that's going to help you with that. All right, so for the week then, you can review the items that are in the course reading list, and you should be able to get to that on your own. And then it'll follow along with what we're talking about. And to do for this week, you need to make sure that you've contacted someone if necessary for mentorship if you need it. And then perhaps being in contact with your school psychologist or special ed coordinator, director, whoever, who can provide you with some assistance as you move forward in the class. And then you're going to start looking for somebody to provide you a student for the case study subject. And keep in mind that this does not need to be anybody who's in special education or even being considered for special education. It's essentially the rules indicate that it's supposed to be a regular ed student. If you're looking for individuals to pursue on this, you might consider relatives, nieces, nephews, whatever the case may be, neighbors, just really just anybody whose parent is willing to allow you to go through the process of gathering necessary information for the project. And again, the parent permission has to be obtained before getting your permission. And there is a parent permission form in the course materials as well. All right, so let's talk about evaluations and reevaluations. First off, initial evaluation is one that is the first complete assessment to determine if a student has a disability under IDEA. and the nature and the extent of the special education and related services that the student needs. So the very first time that as a student is evaluated, that becomes an initial evaluation. And this can occur early on in terms of taking a look at developmental disabilities for students who are in preschool, and or it could extend into when you get into a later grade into school. If academic or behavioral, social, emotional concerns come up, then that would become an initial assessment as well. There is a question about whether a student who turns 7 and needs a categorical placement, whether that's an initial or a reevaluation, but it's actually considered to be a reevaluation, but they need to meet initial criteria for one of the specific disability categories. So it's reeval, but they need to meet initial criteria for replacement. Then we have this one. If a student with a disability moves into Minnesota from another state, an evaluation is needed to determine the student's eligibility for special education and related services under Minnesota criteria. So you can look at the evaluation, you can look at all the current information that's there, and you can make a determination as a team. Does the information that was provided meet the Minnesota criteria for placement in special education? And if so, then you can go ahead and rewrite the IEP using that data. If it does not, then you'll need to start all over. You can still pull in the information, but it'll be an initial evaluation. Next, of course, any subsequent evaluation of that student would constitute a reevaluation. And the most common of that is the 3-year reevaluation that's required. Sometimes, though, the reevaluation might even occur before that 3-year period is up. Okay, so when you're doing an evaluation, there are many areas that can be considered or could be considered. So these areas concerns could be general health, vision and hearing. And as you know, for the special ed assessment, you do need to take a look at vision and hearing screening. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that vision and hearing are not the issues that are creating the problem for the child, or what we call an exclusionary factor. Obviously, if a student is deaf, blind, and you have to have a situation where you have to rule out that as being the source of a learning disability or something like that. You just need to make sure that you're looking at the entire picture when you're starting your assessment of the child. And ruling out those exclusionary factors are important. Another area is intellectual ability. Our IQ testing, usually done with the WISC-5 or some other KTEA, a KABC, those types of tests, and some others too, when you might get into nonverbal assessment for ability. Social skills testing like the BASC, the Achenbach that used to be used quite often. Sometimes you may be looking at things such as executive functioning, a variety of different things like that. Emotions, behaviors, school ability, and academic skills. So you certainly can bring into play things such as work samples and so forth. Those are really actually very valuable. And when you do gather work samples, you want to make sure that you go back and talk to the classroom teacher and ask if those are actually pretty exemplary of what the normal school performance is for that child. Communication, obviously, everyday living skills, motor skills, and then so that would be both fine motor and gross motor. You don't necessarily have to do all these assessments. You have to make a determination as to whether you do need to make do the assessment. The use and need for any technology, so assistive technology, pencil grips, listening devices, and they can be anything from minor tools to things such as language boards and things like that, electronic devices. Functional behavior for things like the ABAS, Adaptive Behavior Assessment Scale, and so forth. Those might fall into that category. Concerns related to specific disability, and if they're 14 or over grade 9, you look at transition skills as well, and take a look at how that may be impacting future programming. Go back to behaviors and social emotional in particular, some of the more common testing that's done. Again, I mentioned the BASC, but it could be the Connors, it could be just a number of different things. You also have to look at what we call comorbidity, and comorbidity might indicate that there are several characteristics that actually go across disability areas. There are certain things that you might see in a student that has a ASD category that you would also see in social emotional or in SLD. So that topic is called comorbidity, and I'll have a little more to share about how you might be able to see some of the common characteristics amongst the various disability categories. Evaluation planning meeting is the next thing that you need to do when you've gotten to the point where you've decided that assessment is necessary. There needs to be a meeting to plan that assessment to see what's going to be in it. So it's a meeting to discuss and plan for the special ed evaluation. The first part of the meeting focuses on what is happening at school and what concerns are the parents and the students and staff have, and what are the areas concerns that are, and what's working and not working. The second part focuses on exactly what tests or tools might be used in order to gather that information. And that could be anything from observations to checklists to again, specific standardized tests and maybe even some informal assessment tools. So who's going to attend that meeting? Typically speaking, the parent will be there to provide information, a district representative who is oftentimes the school principal, but it could be somebody else as well, perhaps the special ed director or even the superintendent on occasion. School staff and with an expertise in the area that concerns. So basically the special ed teacher would be the individual. And again, if you're looking at assessing an EBD kid, you want to make sure that there's somebody who understands that process at that meeting. It could also be that you're going to look at a couple of different areas, and you may or may not have everybody at the meeting, but in the assessment, you need to make sure that if you're assessing, let's say, ASD concerns, there needs to be somebody on the team that has the knowledge in that specific area. And then finally, the classroom teacher should be there as well, regular ed classroom teacher. And if you want to include some of the others and some of the specialists, that's fine as well. At secondary level, of course, you're going to be bringing in more than likely just a representative, like perhaps a social teacher or a math teacher or somebody like that. Okay, and so in most situations, these things are included in the evaluation. You need to have the information from the parents and the school staff. The information from the parents is critical because we want to make sure that we're looking at the situation and the child, and you're looking at trying to find out whether concerns exist over multiple environments, and if so, then that you create a much stronger case for there being a disability. The evaluation is going to likely include standardized tests as well. I mentioned some of those already for ability, WISC, KABC, achievement might be the Woodcock-Johnson 4, maybe the TIMA and the TERRA test of early math ability, test of early reading ability, KTEA, and then of course other things such as the checklist that I mentioned before. Observations are always going to be included as well, and for certain things, you're going to need a specific number of observations, and those observations can be done in multiple environments. EBD, for example, we want to make sure that we've got 3 evaluations in there, and I like to look at those observations in different environments just to make sure that the suspected concern, behavioral concern, social emotional concern, is something that that can be identified in multiple scenarios. The next thing is the review of classroom tests and information. Again, as I mentioned, work samples. Really try to get as much as you can in order to be able to help you develop your plan. Okay, moving on. All right, so there's might be some additional information we want to talk about. You really want to try to have more than one type of test for each area of concern. For example, in the social emotional area, you may do a BASC, and you might do a functional behavior profiler looking at the FBA. You might do a BASC and some other type of behavioral checklist, a Connors, for example. And of course, the Connors is going to look more at skills that would be related to potential attention deficit. So if you got a child who is in EBD or OHD, or maybe there's a little bit of each there, you might want to use a Connors in addition to be able to rule in or out some of those ADHD concerns. Tests are done in all areas of concern, and tests might be formal, standardized, could be informal, could be interviews, could be a lot of different things that would constitute that data collection. Every effort should be made to administer in the student's language unless that's not possible. For example, I work in a building right now that is 98% Somali students, and we are unable to provide testing in Somali. So what we need to do then is do our best to do some nonverbal testing. We can use interpreters when appropriate. There are a variety of different methodologies to use in order to be able to gain information on EL kids. And we actually have a section later in this presentation that's going to talk a little bit more about that. When those EL kids come in for assessment, there certainly are considerations having to do with ruling out cultural and language influences in our final report. Also, the tests that are given by trained staff and given according to instructions need to make sure that all of those things are in place and that we're doing the right thing along those lines. It's possible this team might decide that no additional testing is needed to decide that the student is a child with a disability. And this is going to usually come up or will come up during a reassessment. And it's very possible that we can say, we already have all the information that we need. We don't need to be digging more into this. And so it is actually permissible to do what's called a non-reevaluation, where the parent and the teacher, or parent and the school collaborate and decide that a full 3-year reevaluation is actually not necessary to continue services for the child. It's not used very often, and there are some very specific guidelines for that, and we can talk a little more about that later on as well. Evaluations that are done by medical staff and other professionals can be provided to school staff. And if it's an outside agency, you certainly need to make sure that you have a parental permission to share that information. File review can happen, and it's a term that's used by school staff, and a file review can be done instead of doing some of the new evaluations, because a lot of that information already exists and there's no need to replicate it. So the kind of a definition here is that a file review means reviewing what is in the student's school file. And that could include previous evaluations, testing results, progress reports, those types of things. So existing information is not necessarily the same as a file review. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between existing information and file review. Okay. Okay, so evaluation plan. The school is going to provide the parents with a notice that describes the things that are going to be assessed, the types of assessments that are going to be used, and who's actually going to be doing those tests. Okay, so that's the evaluation plan, and that goes out in the form of a prior written notice so that we can begin the assessment. Notice is called a PWN, as I mentioned. The parent should review that evaluation plan, fully understand what the school is going to be doing, and then ask any questions before signing the PWN. That's something that you'll need to maybe verbally talk to them about there and ask if there's any questions or concerns. And if so, how can you help them to understand a little bit more fully? The prior written notice includes a signature page for the parents to sign that they agree with the evaluation plan, that they disagree with the plan, or they have more questions. And certainly they can disagree. And if so, then the district has to make some determination as to what steps are next for that student. For the initial evaluation, the parent must sign the notice before the special ed team can begin the evaluation. So you cannot do anything until you get a signed parent permission form back. And once that's back, then you're off to the races. And then you have 30 school days to complete that evaluation. And make sure you use a calendar and rule out any days that the school is not in session. And then also, if there happens to be like a snow day or something like that in the interim, those don't count either. For reevaluation, the school can actually start the evaluation if the parent doesn't return to the PWN within 14 calendar days. So you send it out, you don't hear anything back from the parents, you made some subsequent attempts to contact them, but you don't get anything back, you go ahead and start the evaluation, because when they signed the first PWN, the first prior written notice, they're essentially saying that that you have the permission to go ahead and work with that child, and you notified them of the reevaluation, but their inability or unwillingness to respond to that request for the reevaluation is not your fault. In 14 calendar days, you just go ahead and get started. Now, I would talk to your special ed director or your special ed coordinator, building principal, whatever, and make sure there aren't any extenuating circumstances as to what's going on, and should you be careful about not proceeding. But I think you need to move forward as soon as you possibly can. Completing the evaluation, the school has 30 school days to complete the evaluation, and that 30 school day timeline begins after the school has received the signed PWN from the parent, just like I mentioned. And then that the 30 days might also start as soon as the 14 days are up. If the PWN was sent out for the reevaluation, the parents did not respond. Okay, so we did all our testing, and now the next thing is that we got to go ahead and have a meeting then to go through that and develop a report. So the school might provide a report to the parents before the meeting, but you don't have to. When the parents come into the meeting, you present them with perhaps a copy of the report that you're going to go through, so that they have the same information that you do in front of them. Best practice would say send it home ahead of time if that's possible. But if you do that, make sure that you mark on the document that it's a draft, so that in case there's some things that are different that come up during the assessment evaluation meeting, then you have some clarity there. At that meeting, what's going to be provided is you're going to include all the information from the assessment. So you're going to talk about what were the identified strengths and needs of that child. You're also going to make a determination to whether the child is eligible for special ed and related services. The parent's going to receive a copy of the evaluation report. And if the child does meet criteria and is eligible, then the IEP may be started at that point. And you can actually go ahead and have the IEP meeting at the same time as the review meeting. And then that will save you having to bring the parents back for another meeting down the road. When you're going through those results, make sure that that if you don't have the psychologist there or one of the other people who did the assessment, that you've got some clear information from them that you can share with the parents. Obviously, the information should be included in the evaluation report, and it should be enough to make your sharing of that information with the parent a little bit easier. Okay, so let's talk now about reevaluations. And I spent quite a bit of time on the reevaluation piece because oftentimes there's questions about what needs to happen in that regard. So the process begins with a review of existing evaluation data about the student. And based on that review and input from the student's parents, the IEP team must identify what additional data, if any, are needed to determine whether the student continues to have a disability. Oh, this is important because you don't necessarily have to do a complete evaluation. If there's already existing information that is ability, and at one point you ruled out that ability is a contributing factor to the disability of the child, then you don't necessarily need to do another intellectual test, or you don't necessarily need to do some other component of the test. But you need to make sure that there's existing information in the student's file that support the reason for you choosing not to do that assessment. So after that review of the existing data, the district must propose in prior written notice provided to the student's parents that you're going to conduct an assessment or other evaluation measures to produce what's needed to determine the continuing need for special education services. Keep in mind that, again, at a reevaluation, you are not having to meet a disability criteria. You are only having to determine whether there is a continuing need for service. And so that's a really important distinction because oftentimes you see people, well, they don't meet criteria anymore. They don't have to meet criteria anymore. All they need to do is meet the standard for continuing need. Okay, so the district must proceed with the reevaluation after it receives informed parent consent or after 14 calendar days that the parents don't respond. I know that's repetitive, but it doesn't hurt to keep saying it over. Now, if the parents object to the district conducting that reevaluation, the district may not conduct a reevaluation until it obtains that parent consent, and it may not use the consent override procedures to pursue a reevaluation. So the parents have the right to nix it. Obviously, the thing you're going to do is have a meeting with that parent and try to convince them of the need for the assessment. Make multiple attempts to do that, because if it comes down to a complaint at some other point in the future, you want to make sure you have your ducks in a row. Also, the IEP determines that no additional data are needed to determine whether the student continues to be a child with a disability, and to determine the student's educational needs. The district must notify the student's parent of that determination and the reasons for the determination. In other words, it's possible that you don't even need to do any testing. And then you talk that over with the parents, and if the parents agree, then you can just move on from there. And you can still determine that that child has a continuing need for services. I also want to do a little caveat here and make sure that anything you hear in this presentation, that if you have questions about it, is you run it by your director, your coordinator, to make sure that your district is following that particular procedure. Because if it's different, then you're obligated to follow what your district is doing. An evaluation report must be completed and delivered to the student's parents within the specified evaluation timeline, which in Minnesota is 30 school days from the date the district receives parental permission to conduct the evaluation. All right, or after the 14 days in the parent's response time. So 30 school days, the assessment has to be completed. And as I said earlier, you can extract anything like spring break or winter break, snow days, the PD days, those kinds of things don't count as school calendar days. If the review consists only of review of existing data, the evaluation timeline commences after the district notifies the student's parents of their rights to request additional assessments, and the student's parent does not request additional assessments. All right. Moving on. Here's existing evaluation data. It's evaluations and information that's provided by the student's parents. Current classroom-based local or state assessments and classroom-based observations, and observations by teachers and related service providers. So all that information is out there, and you can use that as part of your determination as to what the evaluation or reevaluation should look like. If the information already exists, then there's no need, as I said, to replicate that information. So when is a reevaluation required? Lots of criteria for this. So a reevaluation must be conducted at the student parents, or the teacher requests a reevaluation, or if the district determines that a reevaluation is warranted based on the student's educational or related service needs, including the student's improved academic achievement and functional performance. Okay, a reevaluation may not occur more than once a year unless the parent and district agree or otherwise. And it must occur at least once every 3 years unless the parents and district agree that a reevaluation is unnecessary. Again, as I said earlier, you can have that non-reeval, but there are certain criteria that you need to meet. Parent and the district may agree that a reevaluation is unnecessary before the review of the existing evaluation data. And while there's no specific requirement regarding documenting such an agreement for special education monitoring purposes, districts are encouraged to include an explanation in the student special ed file when a triennial reevaluation is agreed to be unnecessary. Again, please run this by your director or your school psychologist or whoever's in charge of due process before you consider doing a non-reevaluation. Next thing, a district must conduct a comprehensive reevaluation in all areas related to the suspected disability before determining that a student is no longer a child with a disability. So if you're going to go ahead and have a child exited from the program, that has to be the result of a comprehensive reevaluation. And again, that comprehensive reevaluation could be just an exhaustive review of all the existing data out there. It doesn't mean you need to do all the testing. It just means you need to review all the available information and make a logical choice. A reevaluation is not required before the termination of a student's eligibility due to graduation from high school with a regular diploma or due to exceeding the age of eligibility for a free appropriate public education. So when they age out, you don't need to do the reevaluation. For a student whose eligibility terminates due to graduation or age, a district must provide the student with a summary of the student's academic achievement, functional performance, which shall include recommendations on how to assist the student in meeting the child's post-secondary goals. Obviously, this is going to apply the last two for only teachers who are working in that secondary setting. Evaluation reports for reevals. Okay, that comprehensive evaluation report must be completed and provided to the student's parents, just like an initial, and it must be done within the evaluation timeline, even if the reevaluation consists of only a review of existing data. At a minimum, evaluation should include the following: a summary of all evaluation results, documentation of whether the student continues to have a disability, the student's present level of performance and educational needs that come from that disability rather, whether the student continues to need special ed. Remember what I said, whether they continue to have a disability and whether they continue to need special ed are not necessarily the same. You can have a disability but not need special education. It's rare, but it can happen. And finally, whether any additions or modifications to the special ed and related services are needed to allow the student to be successful. If the parents and the district agree that a reevaluation is unnecessary, the district does not need to complete an evaluation report. So if you choose the non-reeval, you choose to say that a reevaluation is not necessary, you do not have to have a report. But again, the best practice would be to document in writing in the file that the team chose that route. And that's why there is no new evaluation data or new summary. Initial versus reeval criteria. A reeval does not need to address each component of the Minnesota criteria for the student's disability area. Okay. When a district conducts the reevaluation of a student, that also has a question mark behind it. That should obviously not be there. When a district conducts a reevaluation of a student, the student's IET must review existing evaluation data and input the student's parents to identify what additional data, if any, is needed to determine whether the student continues to have that identified disability. And also whether the student continues to need special ed and related services. Again, I'm going to tell you that some of this is redundant, but it doesn't hurt to hear it over and over again. The reevaluation must also determine the student's present level of academic achievement and related developmental needs. Don't forget things such as DAPE and speech, maybe articulation issues, things such as assistive technology and so forth. And then also you need to determine whether there's any modifications or accommodations that need to be made, and also extend those out to the statewide testing and anything like that as you move forward. Make sure that when you do come up with additional modifications or accommodations that you inform the classroom teachers, and if the paraprofessionals are involved in implementing some of those things, that they are informed and trained and making sure that those things occur. If things have changed, and sometimes things have changed for kids, an evaluation to determine whether the student's disability category has changed or whether the student qualifies under an additional disability category, commonly referred to as a secondary disability, is considered a reevaluation. So if you're looking at adding, let's say the student is EBD and you want to add SLD, then that's also considered in that reevaluation process. However, if you add that secondary area, you need to take a look at what the criteria are for that. Now, there's no requirement to identify a student as eligible under more than one disability category. And that's an important statement, because when you identify a student as being eligible under a disability category, what you are saying is they are eligible for special education. And that creates this huge umbrella under which you can then determine what are the needs. So just because you identify a student as under EBD criteria, you can still then go and say, but he also has some academic needs. So we want to make sure that we're giving him some academic services as well, and maybe some social skill type of services. Those kinds of things can be included. Federal regulations acknowledge that a student might have multiple disabilities, and there actually is a disability category called severely multiply impaired. A student who was discontinued from all special ed services may be reinstated within 12 months without undergoing an evaluation, if data on the student's present level of performance are available and an evaluation had been conducted within 3 years. So if the team says, Johnny's doing okay, we're going to exit him from special ed, and if he falls apart within that year, you can bring them back into special ed without doing an evaluation. And that applies whether the student's special ed services were discontinued after a reeval and a determination of ineligibility, or after the student's parents revoked consent in writing for the continued provision of special ed related services. Now that's important, because sometimes you get parents who get upset, or they don't want their kid to receive special ed services anymore. And then what you do then is you allow that, because that's their right. But then, 6 months later, they've completely fallen apart, and the parents change their mind and say, oh, well, now we realize that we should not have done that. You can bring them back into the program without doing another evaluation. Just make sure that the data you have supports that reinstatement. If more than 12 months have elapsed since the student's special ed and related services were discontinued, district then would need to conduct an initial evaluation. So it's like starting all over again. So after 12 months, then you have to start over. But prior to that, you could just bring them back in. There you go. All right, so now let's change a little bit. We're going to talk about validity and testing, and we're going to wrap this up pretty soon here. So schools can take steps to ensure the validity of their assessment process by choosing assessment that have been developed robustly. In other words, use good tests and tests that have been vetted, and that provide evidence concerning the properties of the assessment and guidance about tests used. You choose assessments that are relevant to the suspected disability. It's important using, the BASC and the Connors, whatever else you might typically use. Make sure that you're using those for the right reason. Use assessments for the purposes for which they were designed, and they can be academic, intellectual, social, emotional. You might have things such as reinforcement surveys, whatever. You can do all kinds of things that would meet the needs. You kind of go from there. You follow the assessor guidelines that are provided with the assessment in order to create consistency in the test administration and scoring process. For example, when we do ability testing, it's one-to-one, nobody else in the room. And you ask the same questions in this exact same way that you ask of every other student. And you follow the scoring protocol the same way. So, and that would be true for your administration of the achievement testing, like the Woodcock-Johnson or the KTEA or something like that. You use standard protocol to make sure that you're following those guidelines for validity. And the other reason for that is because it's a standardized test, and the results are normed, and so you're doing a comparative score, and you want to make sure that the comparison is legitimate. That's one of the reasons why you work with kids that are EL kids. You may not actually be able to report scores because they're not in the norming group. Okay. Next thing, draw conclusions from the assessment data in an appropriate way, considering other factors that may influence pupils' test scores, such as physical, emotional, psychological factors. Those are those rule outs that I talked about, or those exclusionary factors. And you also need to make sure that those who score the test have been trained properly, and that you're using the right kind of scoring protocols if you're using online scoring, that type of thing. Most of that's pretty self-explanatory though. Okay, so then we talk about standardization and confidentiality of the test materials and content. Okay, confidentiality is the act of protecting all personally identifiable data, information, and records that are collected and kept by the school about a student. So it's important that confidentiality is talked about and that people are trained accordingly. Essentially, what it comes down to is all information is given out on a need to know and a right to know basis. That's why we're very concerned about making sure that there's no teacher lounge talk. There's no talk between the parent and the teachers in the hallways and those kinds of things. All the information is confidential and needs to be protected. In addition to fulfilling those legal obligations, the high standard of confidentiality is there to maintain an environment in which students with disabilities feel respected, safe, supported, and protected. That's a really important piece as well. And confidentiality refers to your obligation not to disclose or transmit information to unauthorized parties. All right, so that's that. But we're done for the week. There's a couple of discussion board questions. Make sure that you reply to those. If you have any questions, make sure you email me. Again, you can text me 320-267-2540. Call me, whatever. I can set up a Zoom meeting with you individually if you'd like, whatever you need in order to be successful in the class. So until week 3, hopefully this is valuable to you, and we'll see how things progress. Let me know if you need anything. Thank you very much.